your position. And finally, either way, I say the monuments of stone and metal, the monuments of cloth and wood, all the man-made monuments must come down. I defy any sentimental Southerner to defend our ancestors to me. I'm quite literally made of the reasons to strip them of their laurels. Lisa, as a woman of color, how do you respond to this?
Oh my goodness. As a woman of color, I say yes, as in YAAAAAS. Yes. I think that really, literally, there's lots of different ways that you can address that question. You can begin to speak to that. I choose first the theological, and then to go into the history right now, history and the right now. Theologically, we know from the very first page of the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis 1, we know that all humanity is made in the image of God. That actually is a monument. We are monuments to God. We are the icon, we bear the icon, the Salem of God. And what that means is that we are supposed to be representative figures of where God rules. Now, the funny thing about the Confederate monuments is that when they were constructed, following the end of the Reconstruction, most of them came up right around the 1880s, 1890s, and then you still had them coming, being erected, in the turn of the 20th century. But most of them came up in that time. It was literally, they were planting. It was almost, forgive my being kind of prosaic here, but it was like a dog pissing to claim space, to claim territory. And you had the reclaiming of Confederate territory through these monuments. That is exactly how the ancients used to think of the image of God, or the image of the king. The image of a king, wherever it went around the world, was a marker of where that king rules, right? But where the images of that king had been crushed, you knew there was war against that kingdom happening in the land. Well, there's very similar images that are happening right now with those Confederate monuments. They are coming down. They're coming down because there is a movement that is afoot in our world that is beginning to say no for the first time, really for the first time ever, saying no to this. Because we had abolition. But very soon after abolition, within 10 years, they said we have the Harding Compromise. And then that's when you have the monuments that come up. And from that whole time, nobody's ever said no to this before in any major way. Now you do. So what are they saying no to? They're saying no to the rule of the Confederacy, no to the rule of human hierarchy, no to the erasure of the image of God in whole portions of our citizenry, of our polis, of the republic. And that is really causing for some major disequilibrium because they've never known a world like that. They've never known a world where they were not centered, where they were not, the victor. But for others who, for the last 1,600 years, have been under the thumb of white empire, have been under the thumb of white colonization, it is actually a monumental throwing off of that oppressive force, and calling for the equal recognition of the image of God in all, the call of all to exercise dominion in the world, the call of all to exercise stewardship of the world. So when I look at those monuments coming down, what I actually see, I see God coming against those monuments. I see this is something people didn't really lobby for this for 10 years. They weren't writing letters to the governor saying we want the monuments to come down in my city. But no, this happened in a week. It was amazing. Now people were out there, pushing for it, but it's not like it had a huge movement just to come down. I think what we see is white rule falling. And in order for white rule to fully fall, the monuments to white rule must also fall.
And yet in other societies where they've torn down monuments, there hasn't been all that much change. Has there been? I mean, it's a step in a larger larger process. But there are some people who would argue that leaving those statues up with some sort of historical marker to teach.
No.
Why is that? Tell me that. Why is that? Why? Okay, I'm hearing you. But right,
I will just say,
this is not a position that
I know.
I'm representing a position that you hear. So help us.
I just say no, because if they belong anywhere, they belong in a museum, not on a street corner. It's a very difficult thing to, let's put it this way. Could you see Germany erecting a monument to Hitler and putting it in the center of a square with a little plaque saying, this is what, no, you could not. And the reason is because Germany actually repented. America has actually never fully repented. And the South has never repented. The South was arm wrestled to the ground, but it never really fully repented. There needs to be repentance. And repentance doesn't happen if if the narrative has been twisted, if slaves are called laborers, low-wage laborers, if slavery is called the lost cause. The South is the master of spin. They have spun an entire history that has kept their people believing lies, and monuments enforce those lies.
So let me pick up. Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
I think this is important. The reality is, in order for there to be repentance, somebody has to either be sorry or exhibit some regret. And there is very little desire to repent, because many of them don't feel, those who want these monuments to continue to be there, they don't feel that they should be responsible for what their forefathers have done. And what's really sad about it is, you opened up, Rabbi, talking about memory, or should we really call this a conversation about amnesia? You opened up talking about telling our story. Well, the question is, who is the our that you're addressing? And if we talk about those men, let's be honest, many of those men, and I want to keep pointing out, most of those statues are of men. Many of those men are heroes to somebody. For example, Christopher Columbus. Every time we celebrate, quote unquote, Christopher Columbus, we are reminded, right, and I would encourage all of the folks who are watching to read Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroot. We are reminded of the pain of our matriarchs and patriarchs. How could you call such a terrorist, Christopher Columbus, who claimed to have discovered America? How do you discover something that is already there? How do you discover land where people were already there living? And the honest truth is, it was George Floyd's death that has been the catalyst for now what Black people have been knowing and calling for a long time. Now we finally have a few more white people who are saying, well, maybe we should consider this. And my prayer is that a new mindset from the Christian perspective, the word repent means to change the way you think. And I pray that true repentance will take place of all of humanity, to say we need to change the way that we think. Because as we continue to see these monuments, we have to relive the trauma that our great-grandparents have lived for many, many years while they were alive. And that post-traumatic slave syndrome talks about vicarious trauma. Those wounds are relived.
So we're going to come back to this a little later, but if anyone has really gone through this process of, I'm going to use the Hebrew word tshuva, because tshuva really means to turn and face your past and face yourself. It's Robert W. Lee IV, who tells his story, and is such a courageous person and such an inspiring person. I want to acknowledge that journey. Rob, you published a piece in the Washington Post recently, and you wrote, "I'm fully aware that the broken racist system we have built on the lost cause is far larger than a single statue. But the statue of my ancestor, Robert E. Lee, has stood for years in Richmond, as an idol of this white supremacist mindset. The statue is a hollow reminder of a painful ideology and acts of oppression against Black people. Taking it down will provide new opportunities for conversations, relationships, and policy change. So when you hear this conversation, Rob, that's going on between Lisa and Chris and me when they let me get a word in, what's your response and how are you reading this?
Well, first of all, Lisa, welcome to this crew. You're going to be a part of it now, I feel like, with Michael and Chris and I. We end up getting together far too often, and probably not for our own good sometimes, but it's good most of the time, I will say that.
Okay.
I think what I'm hearing is something that makes me actually incredibly uncomfortable, and in a good way. I don't like hearing this stuff because it makes me reckon with my own past. And if I had to bet, if I were a betting man, I would suspect that a few people who are listening in on our conversation are feeling that way too. Mm-hmm. But I'm actually going to ask them to sit with that for a second, because I think it's really easy for me or them to just, tune it out, mute the microphone, just turn it off, not sit with the pain that you are obviously feeling. One of the things I've been doing in this whole process since I really came onto the public scene in 2017 after Charlottesville was, people would send me all this stuff, Robert E. Lee stuff, like I wanted it, like I have an extra space in my garage for it. So I've donated most of it to museums or charities that ensured that it would go to museums and then raise money for that. But I got this one piece that actually is coming in the mail now that is a signed paper from Robert E. Lee. And so I've really committed to myself in this moment to do some research on the man, more so than I have. I mean, I've done extensive research, but I picked up the old books from right after Reconstruction. One of the things that I think is interesting to remember about specifically our conversation here, and this struck me, it hit me hard, was that Robert E. Lee led the squashing of the insurrection at Harper's Ferry. Mm. So he led the slave insurrection, but this was not as the South. He was a colonel in the United States military. Mm. So this notion for all of us that this is just a Southern thing that happens down here where I am, I want to make sure that we impress upon people is both misguided and wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the South is the hotbed. It is ground zero for this racism, for this pain, for this white supremacy, for this idolatry of the lost cause. But I'm sure Pastor Harris can attest to in Chicago that there are some real problems that are going on with how people view Chris and, of course, Lisa, and even Rabbi Michael in his, with his identity as a Jewish man. I think there's some real problems, and that's getting far larger in scope. But I think it is in a sense an indictment on our culture, as we feel like we have a ship without a captain, or a ship that wants to a captain that wants to raise the wrong flag. We have someone who wants to celebrate these things as we're trying to have these deep conversations. And it's not just in places of power, it's at our Thanksgiving dinner tables. And so what we're going to have to do, especially as white folk, we're going to have to reckon with this. We're going to have to sit with the uncomfortability. And, that may sound really not fun, but, being Black in America for the past 400 years, since the first enslaved person arrived at the Jamestown colony, I mean, that's been some pain too. So I'm not saying it's tit for tat, but we've got to sit with the pain and at least listen to it. And I think that actually allows for atonement. So
when you go ahead, Lisa, jump in.
It's funny because I met Rob at an event in North Carolina about a year ago, and it was really, really awesome to be able to meet you. I was very honored, and actually I think we got to drive in a car with you at one point. That was really fun. And I don't know if we got a chance to talk about this, but I am a genealogy freak. I love genealogy. And my next book is actually tracing 10 generations of my own family here on this soil. And it goes back to 1682 Maryland. And Ancestry.com has actually traced us at the very least to 1700 Virginia.
Wow.
And I know. And so I actually We might be related, like literally. There's a lot of Lees. I have a lot of Lees in the DNA matches. And I don't know what the connection is. I don't know exactly how or where. I do know though that in the early 1700s, they were there. They were in that area of Virginia. And what my mom has said of my DNA, talk about a monument. And so this is why I related to the woman who, the poet who wrote the article this last weekend in the New York Times, that my mom looks at our DNA and it's very clear. We are a map of the slave trade. Like that's what we are. We are a monument. My body is a monument to the slave trade. You literally have all the slave trading nations are there, as well as many different nations from which enslaved people were captured. So the question of sitting in it, I deeply believe that part of the pain of it, Rob, is the having your view of the world shattered. Like the deepest part of the pain is realizing that people lied to you. That really is, it's a feeling of betrayal. And then not knowing what to trust or who to trust. And I would really love to hear you reflect on that. But I know that for me, I mean, my faith was born in the white evangelical church, actually, right? So I have gone through over the last decade that kind of a shattering experience of my white evangelical worldview, as I began to understand that my faith had been colonized. Right. So I have been in the process of decolonizing my faith. That's my whole last book. And that's I was depressed for a year, when I first began to understand, why did I not ever know this? Nobody's ever told me these things before.
Right. I think, I don't want to take too long, and I'll just respond to your question, Lisa. And I think, I tweeted the other day, I feel like evangelicalism can be really unhealthy for Christians sometimes because
oh my gosh.
We don't, that's a whole other conversation for another day.
Yeah.
But, I think to your point about, I found out by kind of vocation of receiving an email that shouldn't have gone to me from family members that my great grandmother was a member of the Klan. And I had kind of known, I had guessed, but until you see it as the confirmation on paper.
Yeah.
And so what that did for me was not only reckon with my thoughts of her as this loving, genteel woman, but it also brought it even closer to home than even Lee himself, who I can kind of push out to the side and say, you know what, history's history, which white people can be really good at doing. That being said, when it comes time to reckon with what a lady I knew in my lifetime, who was a secretary for the Ku Klux Klan of North Carolina, that's a whole different ballgame. And that's when when you said that of reckoning kind of with relatives, that's as close as it gets. Mm-hmm. And so what we have to do is specifically as a white person of faith is engage that conversation in my own business. Like, it's not incumbent upon Lisa, it's not incumbent upon Chris to do that work for me, because they're dealing with, as Chris said so eloquently, they're dealing with their own pain. And so what I have to do is be careful not to push that out on you and say, hey, I need you to help me with this.
Yeah.
Now, if you offer, that's a different story. But, I think for so many white people, we just want to say, hey, I'm here for you. Let me tell you my story. Let me tell you how my grandmother was in the Ku Klux Klan and how that, affected me, as if we're trying to find a fellow compatriot in this. But in reality, we kind of need to deal with it ourselves.
But let me jump in and kind of take it back to Chris for a minute, because Chris, you made a comment earlier about, white people involved. And, I find Rob's comments to be inspiring. I found it to be inspiring to be part of a march where where you had basically a cross section of America, Jews, Christians, Muslims, right? White, brown, black, and every other color in between. And I And I find this to be a remarkably hopeful time. And I'm wondering how you respond to Rob. Is it too little, too late? Is it, what do you think?
Yeah, I got to tell you, Rabbi, you were at the helm of it. We led 2 marches, 14 to 15,000 people, as you said, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, Catholic, Latinx, etc. And we have so many people that are saying Black Lives Matter, right? And that's awesome. And one of my favorite things is to hear white people say, I'm with you. But it's interesting to me because if you're with me, but I can't look to the right or the left and see your feet standing with me, you're not with me, right? It has to be more than words. And unlike, Rob, like it's pretty hard to kind of, come against Robert E. Lee's statue and your name is Robert Lee, right? he can't hide. So that's faith in action. That's more than talking the talk. That's walking the walk. And I'll be honest, I don't mind listening to talk. That's great. But the question is, are the conversations real enough and authentic enough, sincere enough, that they will lead to the deconstruction of systems that white America still benefit from today? And those systems are by design the same systems that destroy the Black man, the Black family, Black communities, and any opportunities for Black people. See, Grandmama used to say it this way, Rabbi, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And we often say this: say nothing until you do something.
Yes.
About racism and anti-Blackness. Because there are many people who are saying, hey, I want to get involved. And what I love about our conversations is they always are laced with an opportunity that leads to action. With Faith and Justice and Peace that we just launched in the March, we're focusing on the 5 things: systemic racism, which underneath that you have police brutality that is either produced or protected. You have economic and community development, right? Where you have Black entrepreneurship, you can have workforce development skills and great opportunities. Don't tell me Black Lives Matter. Open up your board and let me see how many of them sit on your executive team. Let me see what your leadership is up there, because anybody can hold a sign. But will you be the sign that everybody else needs to see to say, I'm going to model my expectations of everybody else? If you know that there is racism, we need more white people to stand up and say, I am anti-racism, right? We need to make sure that people are saying, I really want to get moved to the place where I can actually do something. And I remind people, as they say, you're erasing history. No, not necessarily. What we're trying to do is say, hey, either erase all the history or tell the whole story. Because if we're going to talk about the good that these people did, let's talk about the bad that they did as well.
So I want to think about this in biblical terms.
Yes.
Thin versus thick. And, Lisa, you wrote about this in your book, The Very Good Gospel, how everything wrong can be made right. The thin way of looking at a biblical text and the thick way of looking at a biblical text. The thin way of looking at a biblical text is to simply take the text at face value, whatever it says in the moment. The thick way of reading a text is to kind of look at its context, look at the history, kind of do a 360 around the text on every level. And it strikes me that that's a wonderful way of looking at this moment. What is the history that we share? What is the history that we can be proud of in this moment, right? Look, right outside of our door, or my door, there's Sheridan Road, right? It's named for Philip Sheridan. Philip Sheridan was one of the great Indian murderers out there. He's the person who coined the phrase, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Yeah? Right down, I would say, about a little more than a mile from him, there's a huge statue of him, right? He's wearing a Union uniform, by the way. So, so he's not going to get torn down. So how do we, and yet he was a great soldier. He fought for, he helped to lead the Union Army. So how do we look at this? How do we understand this? How do we begin to read a thicker understanding of this? Because, Lisa, you wrote a piece on the 5th of July. So I'm going to read part of this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Where you talk about General George Washington had bad teeth. His solution? To wrench teeth from the mouths of men and women he owned to create his own dentures. Right? Why not? In his plantation, he courted 317 men, women, and children who he believed existed to benefit his flourishing. They grew his tobacco, they birthed and grew his free labor, they grew his teeth, they were things. President Thomas Jefferson expanded white flourishing and in indigenous genocide westward as he groomed and serially raped his 14-year-old slave, Sally Hemings, his wife's half-sister, and then he profited off of the free labor provided by the children Sally bore. And here, you bring this to a crescendo, the timpani roll of the tyranny of whiteness has roared in the background of the American symphony since 1776. But in the same sermon, you write, 76 years, Douglas said, Frederick Douglass you're talking about, though a good old age for a man is but a mere speck in the life of a nation. Nations number their years by thousands. America is young. She is still in the impressionable stage of the existence. And now you continue. If Douglas was right, then at the age of 244, America is still young. We are still at an impressible age. The heart of the American struggle beats with one disruptive question. Will we strive for the more perfect union that those same founders enshrined in our national project? Or will we be captured by their own lack of capacity to imagine a world where all might live free and flourish and have a democratic say in how we live together? Mm-hmm. Are we not, and here's my question then, are we not building on the foundation that they built? I'm talking about Jefferson, right? You know, in his words of the Declaration of Independence, or the democratic ideal of a president that Washington gave us and not a monarch. How do we look at these people through multiple lenses? That's my question.
I think that the question that we really have to ask is, how do we want to live together? Like, that is the question. That's the question. And up to this point, the white imagination has determined the rules of how we answer that question. We have only been able to answer that question within the rubrics and constructs and imagination that came to us from Europe. So all of our debates are whether or not we like capitalism or socialism or communism. Those are all European models. Those are all European understandings of commerce, understandings of, you know, everything. So I am not saying now that we need to go out and, you know, find a new party. And our entire system, every single thing, everything we do has been shaped by the white imagination, by the European imagination. And what we have to understand is that they didn't come here in a vacuum, and that imagination did not just surface out of God's thin air. That imagination surfaced out of struggle that happened on that land. That imagination surfaced out of sin that happened on that land. So you had centuries of conquering. I just had a good conversation with one of my girlfriends the other day. She was asking me, she's white, and she was asking me about this stuff. And I think I had a little bit of an aha. You know, she was saying, well, what about like before we got to America? What were we like? And I said, well, actually, I think that the deepest part of the cry of the white soul is for a sense of identity, a sense of place, a sense of belonging. And people of European descent have replaced belonging with success, replaced belonging with power, belonging with power, really, with power and money, with opulence. And that didn't start in America. That in the European project, that goes back to Rome, that goes back to the Greek Empire, but it also comes through England. And this also goes through my own family. My family, the people who inserted themselves into my bloodstream, who were from Europe, were one of them. The family was from the King Henry VIII's court. And he was,
Mhm.
they were right there when William the Conqueror came in and created England in 1066. But when he did that, he conquered indigenous people. People were uprooted. England itself is a nation full of uprooted people who actually don't have so much relationship. They only have 1,000 years of relationship with that land, as opposed to the indigenous people.
Right, but I want Rob to weigh in on this for a minute, because, but I also want to think about, what do we do with our founding documents? You know, this country isn't going to start over from scratch. We have founding documents. How do we manage those documents and realize that they were written by very gifted but imperfect people? How do we balance those ideas? Rob, what do you think? How do you weigh? What do you? I'm sorry to kind of drag you in, but you know, let's hear what you have to say, because Lisa just made a very impassioned statement, and I want to hear how you respond.
Well, I don't want to be a counterpoint to that, because I do think what she said is very indeed valid. One of the things that I am aware of right now, and have been acutely aware of, and all my friends at Anshe Emet will know this about me, is that I am a registered Democrat. I am a very progressive person of faith who is committed to justice and equity and all of the things. But I also happen to have this like patriotic stint about me that's just like, you know, I think we all can say we love this country in some capacity. I think the key here is to ask what capacity that is. Are we benefiting from it, or have we been oppressed by it? So what I mean by that is, certainly, you know, Richard Henry Lee, one of my ancestors, proposed the Lee Resolution on July 2nd, 1776, which led to the commissioning and signing of the Declaration of Independence 2 days later. So I'm acutely aware that without Lee's, there wouldn't be a country. That being said, with Lee's, there was a divided country. We have to stop venerating these individuals as idols. And that's really what they are. They've become idols. We have to stop venerating them as such. We have to stop venerating this idea that the system is perfect and therefore can't be touched. Am I an advocate for blowing the whole thing up? I don't know. I think the jury's still out for me. But I do know we have to do something different and therefore holy. Because God calls us, all of us, to be holy people. And to seek holiness. And part of that holiness is also a wholeness, W-H-O-L-E-ness, that is required of us, that seeks to involve people in this conversation who don't look like you or me, Rabbi, and that's no offense to us, but also like Lisa and Chris, and we're seeing that more and more in Congress, but that's also going to take someone looking like Lisa in the White House. Maybe Lisa would like to run. You know, but like someone like that, you get what I'm saying, though. It's going to take a seismic shift that is already underway, that we are going to have to embrace.
I'd certainly like to chime in on this one, Rabbi, and
Please.
I get excited about these kinds of conversations. I am absolutely not an advocate of blowing the whole thing up. I am not an advocate of getting rid of all of the history. Let's talk about those founding documents. I think what we should do is not get rid of it, but hold everybody accountable to what they claim they meant when they wrote it. Think about it. Independence. One line, let's just point one specific line out. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What's the next word? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they wrote that. And in order to make sure that Black people didn't benefit from what they wrote, is they said that Black people were not fully human. It's in the documents. They created laws and statutes around that. And the reality is, those men who stated that no one should be man's property had Black people as their property, and they have to be held accountable. And so when we think about how this is, I'll ask you, Rabbi Siegel, I'll ask you, Reverend Rob, knowing what Black people go through, would you be willing, as white men of goodwill, to change the skin you're in and live as Black people today? The way things are, not hopeful, not the imaginary, but would you be willing to do that? That is a real question. If every person who is white, who is watching this now, they got to ask themselves, would I be okay with living as a Black person today?
Okay. I think that's a great question. Would I be okay? Would you be okay? So by the same token, I need to ask you, would you be okay living your life as a Jew?
So that's a great question. Now, so because of my history,
that is because that brings with it its own reality.
Absolutely, but that is the equivalent, right? That moment is the equivalent of the deflection that frustrates Black people, right? That's the equivalent of a person, and I'm talking about as a Black person, that's the equivalent of a Black person saying Black lives matter. But then a white person says, well, all lives matter. Well, that's a deflection that we won't tolerate now.
No,
and I don't mean you, because you live a different lifestyle. You have a different mindset, but the average white person, right? And so if you talk to certain Black people, they would say yes, because you're still in white skin, right? You can actually hide depending on where you go because of your skin. But the difference between me and you is I can't hide as a Black man. You can
there's no question in what you're saying. I hear you. And look, I mean, let's put it this way. I'll just make it as simple as possible. If I'm driving on Lakeshore Drive and I get pulled over, right? What I'm thinking about is my insurance rates going up and having to pay a fine.
That's right.
When the policeman's walk into the car.
That's right.
Right. So my experience and your experience are very, very different.
Yes.
And I think that the more we can appreciate each other's story and each other's reality and hold ourselves true to the founding documents, and here I want to suggest as holy writ of this country. I think our founding documents should be treated as holy writ, our Constitution, right? And I'm going to give you an example from the Jewish tradition. Mm-hmm. I started this conversation by talking about the Passover Seder, right? Whose name does not appear in the Haggadah, the story of the going out from Egypt? Moses. It's only mentioned once, and that's as an aside in a psalm. What's the story then saying? The hero of the story is God. The hero of the story and the mover is God. And Moses is seen as an imperfect vessel. He's so imperfect that he's not even allowed to go into the promised land. But he still gives us the Torah. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, right? If we read that thick history, we're going to see them as imperfect men and we need to see that whole story in 360. But I don't know that we want to throw them into the ash heap of history either. We have to start, where's the balance there, Lisa? Help me with this.
Okay, so I do not advocate throwing anybody into ash heaps. I'm not into that. What I would say, though, is that we do have to see them as human, not as inspired by God, not as God wrote our institutional documents. Our Constitution is not the Bible, and the United States and the American soil is not Jerusalem. It was literally an accident that Columbus did not discover, but went the wrong way when he was exploring. And when they got there, the same person who wrote The City on a Hill, Jonathan Winthrop, it was his idea to do the Pequot Massacre. So we have founding narratives in the United States, as my friend Renee August in South Africa says, Reverend Renee August, that our founding narratives actually bear fruit. When we venerate, when we lift up when we see our founding narratives as the thing that then defines us, then that can actually give us all manner of justification for evil. And that is what our founding narrative has done.
Except that I wasn't, wait. I wasn't talking about the founding narrative. I was talking about the founding documents.
Mhm.
And that and the fact that the founders of this country, when they said all men are created equal, did not include people of color.
Or women.
Also, that's a fact. That's a fact that we can't get away from. But at the same time, this law code, these documents have evolved.
Well, look, so this is where I just differ with you on this, because yes, they have evolved, but they also haven't. They've shapeshifted. So in 1662, Virginia writes its first race code, the very first race code, and it's House of Burgesses, and it's in response to a bunch of enslaved people who are mixed race, who are now claiming that they should be free because their fathers are English citizens and they're baptized. So according to the law, they should be free. Elizabeth Key is one of them, and she and all of them are set free. And they start realizing, wait a minute, we're losing our free labor. So they change the law to now go according to the law of partis. And that law, the law of partis, is even to this day actually what describes what we point to say who is Black. But at that point, it determined who is a citizen. So citizenry, race, and gender were all mixed up in that same one law. And now, you see it again, it comes back together again with those other founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, when they say, no, this is for men. And the Immigration Act of 1790, when they say, no, this is for white men. And the census, when they say, no, this is for only white people. In other words, we're not going to count anybody but white people in here. They're only people we think of as people. So our founding documents came out of a narrative, and they actually established a narrative. And the narrative that they established is those who are truly American are white Americans. That's what it means to be American. It means to be white and male. Now, that is what I was saying in that piece. That's the struggle. That has been the struggle. All of the struggles we've had and all of the movements has been to determine whether that is true or not.
Let me also add, I could never call the document, the Constitution, holy.
No.
If you watch the documentary called 13th,
Yes,
it's about the 13th Amendment. And if what the 13th Amendment has done to the Black community is holy, I'd prefer to be an atheist. When you look at the passage of the 13th Amendment, it specifically states these words: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the bottom line is, the only way you can be a slave is if you are considered a criminal. And there are many prisons across this country that are filled with 90+% Black people. And no person on the earth could convince me that white people don't commit crimes. The difference is their mothers and their fathers are judges or lawyers, or they have enough money to get out. And let me go even further than that. The reality is, at the end of the day, until we honestly admit that what some would consider a holy document has been carried out in unholy ways, particularly against one demographic of people, until we're ready to honestly admit that, then we're not ready for repentance, and we're certainly not even close to reconciliation.
Listen, I think we're disagreeing on a semantical term, a term of semantics.
Okay.
If we can't agree that on our founding documents, this is what we have to work with, and that these documents have been used in negative ways and in positive ways. But at the heart of those documents is the promise of America. That, to me, right, you know, there are sections of the Torah that are not applicable today. There are sections of the Torah that go against my grain, right? But the essence of Torah is the holiness of that document. And I guess I want to say to you that if we can't agree that that our founding documents are worth venerating and building and embracing and allowing to evolve to a new age, then I'm not sure how we're going to go forward. That's my real concern here, is that that anarchy becomes a possibility when you can't even agree on your founding documents. Not to say that they're flawed. I'm not suggesting that.
Yeah.
They're not. Holiness means that they're set apart. That's the biblical understanding, that you raise them up, you set them apart, and you raise them up. And again, if we can't agree to do that, then I'm not sure what happens then.
So I go back to my question. The document that is considered holy, would you want to live by it as a black man?
I would work like I will, as a white man and a black man. If I was a black man, work to, I think we work to make those documents evolve as a society. That's our choice.
Wasn't the question.
I just want to say that is the Jewish approach to a text.
Got it.
Right? I don't know how else to answer. Rob, you haven't said anything in a while, so I'm going to call on you to jump in.
Well, I'll say, I think Chris posed that question to me, and I don't want to seem like a falling on the sword here, but I do hate myself for my answer. What I'm acutely aware of is I never was told not to walk around my street with a BB gun for fear of being shot. I never was told not to wear a hoodie to school because I might get accosted by the police. That was something that was never in my vocabulary growing up. And there's a certain pain that goes along with that, now recognizing that. And I don't want to suggest it's white guilt, because that too could be the case, but I think it's a recognition, of course, of what Pastor Chris is saying, that to be a white man in America, especially a white, Anglo-Saxon, waspy kind of person, is something of a lottery win. Rabbi Michael, I think to your point of what you're saying about the text, I think it is a semantics thing, but perhaps let me just for a moment try and put it in terms that might, I think I want to try and translate, and it may not translate well, but at least let me try. In August of last year, I was in Paris preaching at the American Cathedral there in honor of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Paris from Nazi regime and rule. And I stood in a pulpit that had served as the German chaplaincy headquarters. So during that time when Paris was occupied, Nazi chaplains had stood in that pulpit and proclaimed a message of anti-Semitism, of hate, of bigotry. And yet I was there proclaiming a very different message that day, of hope, of liberation, and of reconciliation. And as we were walking out, my wife Stephanie and I were kind of marveling at the cathedral, and she said, how could this have become such a house of hatred and vile, despicable reaction to people that they probably didn't even know, or if they did know, they hated anyway. And that was a reckoning moment for me, because what I think she was saying, and what I think I'm trying to say here, is that we can take a document, whether it's holy or not, and use it for a lot of bad in this world. Whether it's scripture in the form of people, destroying the Torah, or using the New Testament as a means to an end to justify a horrific act, or whether it's, Southern preachers in the South in the 1860s using the scriptures in the Torah to justify slavery. I think what I'm trying to say here, though, is that we have these documents, whether it's scripture, whether it's the documents that some people do hold to high regard in this country. And the question ultimately isn't what we've done with them. We do have to recognize that past. I think what Lisa was saying is recognize the past, but also work towards a better future. And if we're going to do that together, it's going to require some soul searching and understanding that the documents that we've always held in high regard may not be what we think they are. And I hope that helps a little bit, but I'm just trying to kind of get us together, maybe.
If I may I interject?
This is good. I enjoyed this.
So, gentlemen.
How about you do it again?
Thank you. I think that the main thing that I feel like is misunderstood is that to say that the document is not holy is not to say that we don't have it as a starting place. To say that the document is not holy is to say that we do not hold our Constitution at the same level of sacredness as we do the Scripture.
Well, of course.
I need to finish my statement. I'm sorry. Can I just finish my statement? Thank you. That when we think of our future, a good future requires the full diversity of the people who are coming to become America. That within 15 years, the majority of the voters in America will be people of color. And they will be from all over the world. And recognizing that our founding documents were actually the ideas not only located, so I was wrong there, not only located in Europe, but also the Iroquois Confederacy. Also in the ideas of enslaved men and women who were the servants of those people who were putting those ideas together. Stolen ideas, never given credit. So what we must do is we must demythologize that document. We must de-whitify that document and understand that it is not holy, it is not of God, it is of human beings, and therefore it can be changed. Therefore, the document itself has the potential to have amendments. We can do amendments, right? We can change it and find that more perfect union.
I love what you're saying, and I totally agree with that. I think that documents evolve. I think that holy documents evolve. In Hebrew, the word kedusha, which we translate as holy, means separate and elevated. And so I think that those are our documents. And those documents and the history of the amendments to the Constitution is the struggle to make those documents speak to the potential of America, right? And it's in that interchange that I find holiness, right? That's the holiness of the American experiment, right? Is to go back to that document and force it to speak in a different language than the founders would have ever wanted it to hear, right? I mean, you know, if you brought the founding fathers and to look at how we read the Constitution today, I think their heads would explode, right? And to me, that's what makes those documents beyond those people, right? You know, they certainly wrote them, and I think we are the better for those documents. But they are limited. They're human documents. There's no question about that. But it is the process of struggling with those documents in an evolving society where I think America is either going to reach its potential or not. So and it hasn't. It has not as of yet. But it's, you know, an evolving story that we keep reaching to try and become who we can be, and take into account exactly, Lisa, what you were just saying, that the country's changing, right? It's no longer a white country. It's evolving into something very different. How will those documents speak to us? That, to me, that excites me as a potential. To me, that gives me hope for a better future in America. I hope it does for you.
Yeah, if I can add, America was never a white country, period. The reality is the documents were written by white people for white people, and white people are still the only people that are benefiting from those documents. And at the end of the day, Black people were not represented in those documents because we were not a part of the writing of those documents. But the Black experience, right, is where Black people have been misrepresented in those documents. What they wrote, right, what they wrote, the founding documents, quote unquote, did not even include the indigenous people. So we have to go ahead and accept that white people came to America and took it over. And then they brought Black people. Black people are the only immigrants that came to this country, not by choice, but by force and in chains. And until America is willing and ready to acknowledge that and reckon with that and change that. And because if you give those documents to Black people, I have a feeling there are a bunch of lines that are going to be scraped out or whited out, because we see where those documents will call for progress for white people, but significant pain for Black people. So I agree with you. Think about it. Even the white people, most politicians, not even just white, but most politicians, all politicians, even right now, they are trying to figure out, how do we get the Black vote? The whole idea of, Rob, representation or taxation without representation. All of that stuff is very real even now. And so I just want to remind us that America was never a white country. It became one, and it still is one. And until Black people are included, and until Black people are able to be represented in those documents, we will absolutely be abused by those documents.
I think that the difference is between the constitutionalists who looked, I think it's a difference of meaning, not semantics. So when an evangelical, white evangelical says that something is holy, what they mean is that it was written by God and therefore it cannot be changed. They look at the last page of Revelation, where on that last page it says anybody who changes a dot or tittle of any of this text will go to hell. And they say, if you're saying that the Constitution is holy, what that means is that we can't change any piece of it. And that's where you get your constitutionalists that are basically trying to get us back to 1861.
That's right. That's the strict constructionalists.
It's
absolutely.
Not semantics, it's meaning. And so that's why I'm nervous when you say it's a holy document, not because of what you believe, but because of what you're saying will be taken by the majority of the white part of the country.
Right. I mean, from the Jewish perspective, Judaism, the whole Talmudic tradition is struggling with the text, right? And when I sit with Christian clergy and we talk about how Jews can deconstruct a text or turn it around and look at it from multiple vantage points, sometimes Christians say, you can't do that.
Right.
But we do that. And I think that's how a document evolves. I think that's the evolution of the document. I want to end with one question. What gives you hope today, which is July 7th, 2020?
Thanks
what
for
gives
that.
You hope today? What gives you hope today?
July 7th. I didn't know, honestly. Sorry. Go ahead.
I had to look at my watch.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob, what gives you hope?
Well, first, I want to thank everybody. Lisa, it's always good to see you. Chris, always. I hope I get up to Chicago next time I'm there and we can maybe share a meal or something. And Rabbi Michael, I do want to say to everybody listening and watching that Rabbi Michael has helped me write plenty of sermons for my Christian church about things that I had no idea what I was talking about, but I needed help on, and he helped provide plenty of context for me. What gives me hope is the fact that we can still have these conversations, or begin to have these conversations in ways that lead to substantive action. I think Pastor Chris was so astute in noticing that it's so much about these monuments that are built of stone, but also monuments to public school systems and healthcare systems and the school to prison pipeline that will ultimately lead to substantive change when we address those as well. I do believe that these statues are the first domino to fall in a grand game of dominoes. I'm excited about them coming down. I mean, this has been, Rabbi Michael knows this, Anshe Emet knows this. I've been working on these statues, especially the one in Richmond, for 3 years of my professional life now. And I know that I stand on the shoulders of so many people who have worked before me. But we're finally, as Lisa said, gaining some traction, having this conversation. But what also gives me hope, I think, is the notion that this all happened in a few weeks. Look what God can do in a matter of time. And God can do that through us, imperfect vessels. What God might do if we get together and work together. So that's my hope and what gives me hope.
Chris, what gives you hope?
Well, one of the first things that give me hope is the fact that finally a female is in this male group. So welcome, Lisa. Sometimes the three of us need somebody to get us together and whip us into shape. So thanks. Michael, kudos to you, because what gives me hope is we can have these hard and uncomfortable conversations and still be friends, right?
That's right. That's right.
Agree to disagree. And that's exciting. And, I realize even with these conversations, many of the hearts of people that listen or tune in later are as stony as the monuments that we're discussing. But what gives me hope is people are open to understanding, right? They may never agree, but if they take the time to hear, maybe they will shift to understand. But as Rob said, we've seen a lot of change in a little bit of time. So I can only imagine this move has to be owned by Black people, driven by Black people, led by Black people. But as I always say, owned by us, driven by us, led by us, but not just us. And what gives me hope is there are so many white people who are finally listening in a way that I've never seen and this country has never seen in its history.
Lisa.
When I think about history, I think about the span of time in a very similar way that Frederick Douglass thought about nations mark their lives in the thousands. And I think about white rule on earth. I think about the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and then all the empires that came after that in Europe. And I asked the question, how long has it been on this earth that people of European descent have experienced themselves at the center? And it's been about 1,400 years. I mean, think about that. It has been 1,400 years that people of European descent have experienced themselves. Now, they haven't been at the center, but wherever they are at the center, and they went everywhere. And so it is a very deep and disorienting thing, I think, especially for men of European descent, to be de-centered, which is what's happening right now. There's a de-centering. But I have hope because I see so many men and women of European descent leaning into this conversation in a way that I have never experienced. And I think a lot of that is happening because of the young people. The fact that that majority people of color world is already here in grade schools, is already here in high schools. Like, they are already majority people of color. And so they will have a much easier time living in that diverse world than we or older people in our nation. So the turning of time gives me hope. The Kairos moment that we find ourselves gives me hope that God is actually the one moving and that there are those responding. But it also gives us a challenge. It has been 1,400 years. So there's deep, deep work that needs to be done.
Let me talk for just a second about what gives me hope as well. I first of all, the blessing of just having this opportunity to have this conversation. the Talmud is a book of what we call machlokets. Machloket is arguments, right? But the rabbis say that the arguments, there are arguments that are futile, but there are arguments and disputes that are l'shem shamayim, that are for the sake of heaven, right? And those arguments are not about, they're about finding the truth. And I can only understand, that struggle for truth only comes when you're willing to have honest disagreements and hear and listen and shape your thinking based upon conversations like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so a conversation like this gives me tremendous hope, right? That we can talk across religious lines. We can talk across racial lines. My story isn't Rob's story, isn't Chris's story, isn't Lisa's story. And your story isn't my story, and each other's story, right? But the conversation is leading us to a better place where we can talk, where we can be friends, where we can feel each other's pain and look through at the world, at least for a moment, through each other's eyes, and join hands and work for a better future. So thank you for filling me with hope at a time that is so traumatic and tumultuous. Because I know that the people listening tonight, and I hope there are a lot of them, heard something extraordinary from the three of you. And so thank you for the blessing of this time. And I'll look forward to continuing keeping the conversation going. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Hannah Banana.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna head out.
Okay, have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.